Coming up on The Daily with me, Niall Paterson. As the government claims to have saved British steel, others are accusing its Chinese owners of industrial sabotage. So what is China's influence on British industry? There's been an awful lot said about the company British Steel over the past few days, so let me try and quickly bring you up to date. Jingye, they are the Chinese owners. Well, they've been complaining about a lack of profitability pretty much since they took over back in 2020. So Jingye was locked in negotiations with the government whilst threatening the closure of the last 2 blast furnaces in the UK at their Scunthorpe site. Ultimately, those discussions failed, and MPs were ordered back to Westminster on Saturday so they could vote through emergency legislation ensuring the furnaces remained on. But here's the thing. Some have suggested that the Chinese wanted British Steel to fail, a sort of industrial sabotage. And given the hundreds of billions of pounds worth of other key British infrastructure that China owns, well, shouldn't we be a bit worried about that? Paul Kelso is our business correspondent. Hiya, Paul. Look, where exactly are we with British Steel? Do we own this thing or not? Has it been nationalised?
No, it hasn't been nationalised. The government has been clear in what's been a very intense 72 hours that it wants to do this thing in 2 stages. The first stage is to step in, take control, effectively seize this company, certainly as far as its management and its operations from the Chinese owner, Jingye, and to deal with the short-term challenge of keeping the furnaces hot, keeping the plant alive. The practicalities of doing that are now starting to play out in Scunthorpe. So as I understand it, we have a new chief executive who has been appointed this morning, long-term employee of British Steel. So he replaces the Chinese managing director who was running the plant, and he will be working alongside the government's representatives in this. Not yet finally confirmed this, but EY, the accountants, they have a team that is going to be on site today to work alongside the new chief executive. EY were involved in the administration in 2019 of British Steel for a year that ended in the sale to Jingye, so they know it well. Unions are quite comfortable with them, and what they are working on is how they get the raw materials that are crucial, so that is coking coal and particularly iron ore pellets, to the plant in sufficient quantity to keep the furnaces going. And there is something of a mystery about the exact status of some of these materials, but there is coking coal at Immingham at the docks. That's Hull, so that's not very far away. That is from the United States. There's some materials we understand that are on their way from New South Wales, currently somewhere near Liberia, being shipped to the UK with the plant's name on them. There's some iron ore pellets at Immingham as well. It appears they haven't been paid for yet. Is a suggestion which has not been refuted that I've put to a couple of people, that those iron ore pellets Jingye were actually trying to sell on to somebody else to try and recoup some of their losses, which meant they wouldn't have ended up in those furnaces. So there's clearly a wrinkle around who owns these raw materials, but there is confidence that one way or another, whether the material that's already dockside in the UK in Immingham or on its way will get here in time to keep the 2 blast furnaces going.
Paul, remind us, why are these furnaces so important? It seems to be something to do with Virgin Steel, but that's not a company owned by Richard Branson.
It's not, although perhaps we shouldn't rule anything out at this stage, Neil, given the desperation for investment. No, Virgin Steel is a steel that's produced from iron ore. It is harder, it is more versatile than other forms of steel that are made from scrap. So Virgin Steel made from iron ore, and for that you require these extremely hot blast furnaces. The UK now only has these 2 left at Scunthorpe. As I think we've all learnt over the weekend, 95% of the British railways are made of this steel. And it's a fundamental industrial material. If these were to close, Britain would be the only country in the G7 that doesn't have virgin steel production.
Much like our elected representatives, Paul, I dragged myself away from my holidays for that emergency extraordinary session of Parliament at the weekend. And I've got to say, the Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, he was incredibly scathing about the Chinese owners of British Steel. Just explain why.
I did the same, and it was worth it for that, because usually when we're in these kind of processes, what ministers say off the record and privately, and their officials who are paid to talk to the media, is often at odds with the diplomacy of the public language. But this language was pretty damning, and I think it is because they have simply run out of patience and have become convinced that Jingye were not acting in good faith. Remember, the government's been talking for a long time, the previous administration and now the new-ish one, to Jingye about a package of government support to keep this plant going. It's losing a phenomenal amount of money. The government has not long ago signed off £500 million of support to Tata Steel, who run those plants at Port Talbot. They put a similar amount of money on the table. Jingye had asked for more, without guarantees, according to Jonathan Reynolds, that it would keep the plant going. There's this suggestion that some of the materials that were bound for the plant are actually being sold on. That one imagines part of this, it fueled this idea that the company was not acting in good faith and was looking to run this down. Perhaps they may have thought that was a negotiating tactic at the start, but certainly for the minister to have used that kind of language and even suggestions of industrial sabotage not being said out loud perhaps by him, but they've looked at the conduct and lost faith, which took them to, let's face it, an absolutely extraordinary step to take control of the company. Imagine a British owned entity in China being on the receiving end of the same conduct from the Chinese government. I can imagine what the commentary here would be about, well, you know, that's what happens in a country that has scant respect for private property and the rule of law.
Sure, but those who are making this allegation of industrial sabotage on the part of Jingye point out that it does have very strong links to the Chinese government in a way in which British companies operating in China generally would not. I mean, when we look at this allegation of sabotage, I mean, it essentially seems to boil down to the fact that the Chinese wanted to sell us their steel. Is that it?
It's certainly that, and they do. There's a lot of Chinese steel, and there's a lot of Chinese steel everywhere. Most steel is Chinese or Indian. They're huge producers. That's one of the reasons it's become so hard for British Steel and other British-based steel manufacturers to compete. There is an argument that this is all about not just forcing the UK to buy British steel, but also eroding Britain's industrial base, so we don't produce our own. I've no idea whether that's true or not, but if we follow through the logic, it would involve a company seizing on what was a distressed asset, a company administration 5 years ago, ploughing money to buy British Steel. They have lost an enormous amount of money in that transaction, it should be said, and then to run it down and close it, it seems like an expensive way of ending British Virgin Steel production. Who knows if it's right, but certainly whatever the motivation, the end result, government feared was going to be exactly that, and that inevitably leads to greater reliance on China.
Yeah, true, and no doubt for a variety of reasons, the business secretary did not feel that he was able to go that far when he was touring the television studios on Sunday. But speaking to our colleague Trevor Phillips, he did say that going forward, he would not be minded to allow the Chinese to be involved in this very specific part of our industrial base.
Yeah, it's a very candid answer. There is clearly distrust around China, but that is obviously at odds at some of the other pursuit of investment that's going on. It's also not the first Chinese company that has found itself unwelcome after some time in the UK.
That was the point I was just about to make. I mean, don't the Chinese have form? You know, they have been extending their influence into aspects of our economy, into aspects of our industry for a long time now.
They have, and they've been welcomed in, and part of it's actively welcoming Chinese investment, and part of it's just a factor of the way the world is. You know, across industry, China is an industrial giant, and perhaps the most notable example of a Chinese company that was welcomed and then shut out by the state is Huawei, the technology and communications company. Is an affordable tech provider. Consumers loved it. Infrastructure providers like BT loved it. It could do things more cheaply that other companies couldn't in our broadband infrastructure. It got to a point where previous Conservative governments said that is too close to home and they can't be involved in the 5G network, and they are now out. But look, the green energy transition, solar panels, which are sprouting in farmland right across the UK. Most of those are made in China and have a huge footprint. Plenty of other industries where Chinese money has come in. It's come into Thames Water, albeit that was a very bad investment. All that money's been lost. Some of it has been welcomed in by private companies. Some of it is just a fact of where we have to buy stuff these days.
Sure. So you've got the government being incredibly critical of Jingye, the Chinese owners of British Steel, in a manner, in fact, I don't recall them being as critical of Huawei, the company that you just mentioned. And at the same time, we are sending government minister after government official to Beijing to try and strengthen the ties between our two countries. This is a tricky balancing act.
Yeah, it really is. And it was really perhaps the most striking thing today has been that, the government are happy to accept that there's a trade minister there right now looking to drum up investment. It is a balance. It is a source of potential inward investment into the UK, which this government is desperate for, and many would say the country needs. But where that money comes from is a trade-off. If it's just capital, that's fine. If it's elements that are fundamental to, frankly, national security and national resilience, it has to be considered really carefully. So would you let a Chinese company buy British steel? Pretty sure we wouldn't, and we will perhaps have this discussion around electric cars when they start to become really prominent on British roads, and we are now plugging in our devices to those. The question about where that the security of that data is going to grow.
Is this just then a natural reaction to the new world order, in inverted commas, that has emerged since Donald Trump took the presidency again in the United States? That we need China, given that our relationship across the Atlantic is looking increasingly shaky?
I think it's definitely impacted by what Donald Trump is doing. I don't think we're now in a position where we have to turn to China, given the way the tariffs particularly has worked when it comes to the British exports. There is absolutely a knock-on from this, in that the UK and many other countries are wondering if they are going to become dumping grounds for Chinese goods that now they simply can't sell into the US because the tariffs are prohibitive, and they already are. Whether we more than 100% already, doesn't matter how many more percentage point Donald Trump slaps on there, it's not viable. So in the short term, that might be good news because you've got cheaper goods coming from China. That has an impact on domestic industrial base, precisely what Donald Trump is worried about. So Donald has absolutely accentuated the existing tensions and considerations around doing business with China by starting this trade war. But we should get used to, we have had to, it's happened not by stealth, but perhaps unremarked. Chinese investment, Chinese goods are routine. They are part of not just life here, but everywhere, particularly, as we know, consumer goods. You cannot escape them. But this question about the influence and the intentions of Chinese companies and the influence from the Chinese government is here to stay, and is only going to become a bigger question.
Thanks, Paul. We have, of course, approached Jingye for comment. If they get back to us, we will put it in the notes attached to the podcast. But we do have a statement from a spokesman for the Chinese embassy in London, and it says this: "We are following closely the developments of British Steel involving the Chinese private company. We have urged the British side to act in accordance with the principles of fairness, impartiality and non-discrimination, and to make sure the legitimate rights and interests of the Chinese company be protected." The statement continues: "It is an objective fact that British steel companies have generally encountered difficulties in recent years. It's hoped that the British government will actively seek negotiation with the relevant Chinese company to find a solution acceptable to all parties." That's a lot for today. Don't forget to give us a follow if you like what you've heard, and you can let us know what you think of The Daily and the rest of Sky's podcasts. There's a survey linked in the podcast description. We're back again tomorrow.